So let's consider example 12 now, monetary policy and exchange rates. We introduced Monique Kwan in example 11, and most of the remaining examples will continue with her case study. She is the currency strategist at a major foreign exchange dealer and is preparing a report on the outlook for several currencies that she follows. She begins by considering the outlook for the currency of a developed market country. This developed market country has high capital mobility across its borders and a flexible exchange rate. These are very important statements because different models we look at will be defined based on whether there is high capital mobility or not. Just to make sure you understand this, high capital mobility means that money or capital can easily flow in and flow out of the country. Flexible exchange rate, this is something you studied at level 1. This means that the monetary authority of a country lets the exchange rate go up and down based on the market. Okay, so this country has low levels of public and private debt. So at least in the short run, you won't have a fiscal deficit putting pressure on interest rates. Given these conditions, Kwan tries to assess the impact of each of the following policy changes using the Mundell-Fleming model and the Taylor rule. And we are going to talk about both these models over the next few questions. First, let's look at this. These two questions will enable us to understand the Mundell-Fleming model. Specifically, we'll talk about Mundell-Fleming model in a scenario where there is high capital mobility. The Mundell-Fleming model will be different if there isn't capital mobility. Okay, so remember, capital mobility is high. Then how do we operate? What is the first scenario? For the DM country, for the DM currency, increasing the degree of monetary easing will most likely cause what? So what is the monetary policy here? The monetary policy is an expansive policy. It is saying that, okay, let us increase our money supply. Increasing money supply means lower interest rates. So it is expansive, or it is trying to stimulate the economy. What is the impact going to be? The other item has to do with fiscal policy. So we are saying that this country also has an expansionary fiscal policy. What will be the impact on the currency? Before we come to these questions and go over the answers, I'll just remind you about the Mundell-Fleming model. So we'll talk about the Mundell-Fleming model where capital can easily flow in and out. Okay, so let's take two different situations now. Let's first consider the monetary policy, and I will work with monetary policy in green. The two possible scenarios with monetary policy is that we can have an expansionary monetary policy or a restrictive monetary policy. What does an expansionary monetary policy mean? It means that money supply is increasing and interest rates are low. So if you have interest rates relatively low, what will happen to capital? Will it flow into the country or flow out of the country? So capital will flow out because capital pursues high interest rates, right? So capital will flow out. That means the demand for your currency is down. So what happens to the spot exchange rate? It will come down. So an expansive monetary policy, according to the Mundell-Fleming model, causes the spot rate or the exchange rate to come down. And what about a restrictive monetary policy? The opposite happens. Interest rates increase. Since the capital mobility is high, capital flows in, so the spot rate goes up. So this column is the expansionary monetary policy column. So we can say, according to monetary policy, if the monetary policy is expansionary, spot rate goes down. If the monetary policy is restrictive, then the exchange rate or the spot rate goes up. Okay, now I'll change colors and talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy will be in black. Again, with fiscal policy, either the policy can be expansionary or it can be restrictive. What does an expansionary fiscal policy mean? It means that the government is spending more investments by the government, or the government might be cutting taxes. When this happens, then there are more investment opportunities in the country. So interest rates actually go up, capital flows into the country, so capital is in, and the exchange rate goes up. All right, so now this row is the expansionary fiscal policy row. So according to the model that we are talking about, when you have an expansionary fiscal policy, then the spot exchange rate goes up. What about a restrictive fiscal policy? The opposite happens. So you have the exchange rate coming down. So what does this overall model now explain, or what does it tell us? You have 4 quadrants. If you have an expansionary monetary policy and an expansionary fiscal policy, the impact is ambiguous. So I'll go back to red to depict the overall impact. So here the impact is ambiguous. What about this column, or this cell over here? Here also the impact is ambiguous. What about over here? If you have a restrictive monetary policy and an expansive fiscal policy, that will give a boost to the currency, and then the opposite happens over here. Restrictive fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy means that the currency will devalue. Okay, now take this model which we apply in this particular scenario, and let's solve each question. Increasing the degree of monetary easing. So we have an expansionary monetary policy. What does that do? Does it cause the currency to appreciate? Cause the currency to depreciate? Note that here we are just talking about the monetary policy. So as we just saw, what does an expansionary monetary policy do? It causes the currency to devalue. So will cause the currency to depreciate. That is the correct answer. The pursuit of an expansionary fiscal policy by the DM country will do what? Now again, look at this model. What does an expansionary fiscal policy do? That was in black. That causes the currency to appreciate. Right? Will cause the domestic currency's value to appreciate. Combining the two means that we have an uncertain or an ambiguous impact on the currency. All right, continuing with the same example, now we are going to talk about the Taylor rule, which is also extremely important, extremely testable. I'd say Mundell-Fleming is important and testable, so is Taylor rule. As a quick refresher, what does Taylor rule do? It allows you to figure out what the appropriate policy interest rate might be. Okay, now how does the monetary authority determine the appropriate interest rate? It looks very simplistically at the level of inflation in a country. If inflation rate is high, then the monetary authority will raise interest rates. The monetary authority also looks at the GDP, or the output of the country, the real output, the real GDP relative to potential GDP. If the economy is overheated, which means that the real output is high relative to potential, then the central bank will tend to raise interest rates. What the Taylor rule does is creates a model or an equation based on these two variables. So this is what the Taylor rule says, that we can predict the policy rate based on what's called a neutral policy rate. Rn is a neutral real policy rate this is the rate which will cause the economy neither to expand nor contract. So something that hopefully you remember from level 1 economics, when you have a very high interest rate, that pulls the economy back. When you have a very low interest rate, that stimulates, which means that there must be some rate in the middle, which neither stimulates nor slows, and that is called the neutral rate. If we take the inflation adjusted number, then that's called the neutral real policy rate. In our country, the DM country that we are studying, that rate is 2.5%. Plus pi, this is the current inflation rate. Okay, in our example, that is 1%. Okay, then these two parts of the equation basically allow us to adjust the policy rate based on the difference between current inflation and pi star, which is the target level of inflation. Any central bank needs to have a target level of inflation, or most central banks actually in the world do their policy based on some target level of inflation. Plus, this difference is the difference between the real GDP, so Y is the real GDP, and this Y asterisk is the potential GDP. Alpha and beta are coefficients which talk about or which deal with the relative weightage of these two factors. In our example, and in most examples in the curriculum, these two are set to 0.5 and 0.5, which means that there is equal weightage. So this will be given to you if you get a question like this on the exam. So assuming the central bank is following the Taylor rule and that the inflation and output gaps are equally weighted, the central bank will most likely do what? So we just plug now. What is the neutral rate? We plug in this number, 2.5%. What is pi? This is the current inflation rate. So we plug in 1%. The alpha is 0.5. And what is the difference between the current inflation and target inflation? So the difference is -1. The target inflation rate is 2%, so this will be 2%, pi is 1, plus beta, which is 0.5, into the difference between these two. What is y? So the current output gap, they've already given you that difference. That is 0.5%. So when you plug these numbers, what you get is 3.25%. So do the maths and get this number. What is the current rate? It's 2%. So the best answer is C, that the policy rate needs to increase by 1.25. All right, let's look at question 4 now. Here the context is set that the economy is in equilibrium. Given these equilibrium conditions, the central bank's policy response to, and then here there are different scenarios, and note this very important part of the question. We are talking about the central bank's policy response. And what is the impact of the central bank's policy response? Now, if there is an expansionary fiscal policy, does the central bank control the fiscal policy? No, it does not. But obviously the central bank needs to respond to fiscal actions, right? If there is an expansionary fiscal policy, what does that do to the economy? It boosts the economy. What happens to inflation? Inflation tends to go up. When inflation is high, what sort of a policy response can you expect from the monetary authority? What you can expect is that the policy interest rates will be increased. Okay, so that means that A is not the correct answer. An increase in growth. Now again, there is an increase in growth of the economy. How will the central bank respond? When there is an increase in growth, that means your output is probably high now relative to potential. When the output is high relative to potential, the central bank will try to pull back. And how does it pull back? By increasing the interest rates. Now, we are purely focused on the central bank actions here because that's what the question is asking for. The central bank's action is to increase interest rates. This policy of increasing interest rates is going to cause the exchange rate to increase or appreciate. Therefore, this is not correct. An increase in inflation would lead to appreciation of the country's currency. Now, this is true because, again, same point as B. When there is inflation, the interest rate will be increased, the policy rate will be increased by the central bank. When that happens, then the currency goes up. All right, now I'm going to emphasize here. You might be wondering that typically when we talk about higher inflation, we then say that the exchange rate comes down. But this question is asking about what happens based on the policy response of the central bank. So you actually need to fill in the gap over here. You need to say if this happens, then the central bank follows this policy, and then what is the impact of that policy? All right, important, very important to understand. All right, let's look at 5 now. Given these initial equilibrium conditions, the central bank's policy response to a subsequent increase in output gap. Where is the subsequent increase in output gap coming from? It is based on what we talked about earlier, that if we have an expansionary fiscal policy, what will happen to the output gap? The output gap would increase. When the output gap increases, that puts inflationary pressure, so inflation will be high. To curb that inflation, the policy interest rate will be increased. So that's the correct answer. A is not correct because tighter fiscal policy is not in the hands of the central bank in the first place. So that's not true. A depreciation of the currency, when the interest rate goes up, what does that do to the currency? It actually causes the currency to appreciate. Moving on, now Monique Kwan is focused on an emerging market country. So far the case study dealt with a developed market country, so now the context has changed. It is more common to find either fixed exchange rates or controls on capital flows in emerging market countries. So what is the situation with this country? It currently has a fixed exchange rate, but it is thinking of moving towards controlling the capital flow. So moving away from a fixed exchange rate, but imposing some restrictions on capital mobility. The country is considering replacing its fixed exchange rate with a policy based on capital controls. These proposed controls are meant to reduce international capital mobility by limiting short-term investment flows or hot money in and out of its domestic capital markets. This is a hotly debated topic amongst emerging market countries. If you do not have any capital controls, then foreign money can easily come in and easily leave, which might wreak havoc with your domestic financial markets. So there is a debate as to whether that's good or bad. Some people argue that there should be restrictions because if you have money coming in and out very fast, then that destabilizes your domestic economy. Okay, so let us look at the questions. Kwan uses the Mundell-Fleming model to assess the likely impact of various policy changes. The first question is, to maintain the exchange rate peg while increasing the degree of monetary easing, the EM country will most likely have to do what? Now let's understand the context. So in this particular question, we are sticking with a peg, which means that the central bank is doing what it needs to do in order to maintain a certain exchange rate. Another point is that ultimately the exchange rate is determined by the supply and demand for your currency. Okay, and what countries do which have a particular peg, then they buy and sell their currency in the market to maintain that peg. So this question then is actually quite straightforward. increasing degree of monetary easing. What does this do to money supply? So the money supply is increasing. Whenever you say increasing the degree of monetary easing, that means that you are increasing the money supply. If money supply is going up, what's happening to interest rates? Coming down. What is happening to the demand for your currency? The demand is coming down, which means that the value of your currency will come down unless the central bank does something. So what will the central bank have to do in the currency markets? The central bank will have to boost demand. And how does it boost demand? By buying its currency. So then clearly the best answer is C. If it further reduces interest rates, it will exacerbate the problem. Okay? And tightening fiscal policy is obviously not the appropriate response either. All right, moving to 7 now. After replacing its currency peg with capital controls, would its exchange rate be unaffected by a tightening in monetary policy? Okay, now let us understand what's going on. What do we mean by capital controls? Does this mean that we are stopping the flow of capital or restricting the flow of capital? It is restricting, and even over here, all that is happening is limiting short-term flows. It's not saying that we are stopping the flow of capital. So, would exchange rate be unaffected by tightening monetary policy? The answer is no. Obviously, movements in exchange rate will be dampened, but they'll still be there. When there is a tightening of monetary policy, what does that mean? That means that money supply is being reduced. Interest rates are going up. If interest rates are going up, then the currency or the exchange rate will actually go up. Maybe not by a huge amount, but it will go up. So the best answer is that if the question is the exchange rate unaffected? The exchange rate is not unaffected. The domestic currency, as we saw here, would appreciate. So the best answer is B. All right, moving on. After replacing its currency peg with capital controls, the simultaneous pursuit of a tight monetary policy and a highly expansionary fiscal policy by the emerging market country will do what? Now this again, whenever you see this 2 by 2, this is the Mundell-Fleming model, but this is the Mundell-Fleming model where we do have capital controls. The regular video will explain this matrix, but this is different from what we had with capital mobility. Okay, so now I want you to remember this, and if this is indeed the case, what will happen? Expansionary fiscal policy. So we are in this row, and we also have a tight monetary policy. So we are in this column. Then the impact will be ambiguous. Now, here I am explicitly showing you the solution from the curriculum, and I'll read it with you, but I want to emphasize that for all these other questions, even if you think you understand, still read the answers in the curriculum because they summarize the important points very well. So C is the correct answer, ambiguous effect. Why is this correct? Number one, the capital mobility is low, so the induced increase in interest rates is likely to exert only a weak upward pressure on currency. So there is an upward pressure on currency but it is weak because capital doesn't flow in and out very easily. Second point is that the combined impact on aggregate demand is ambiguous. When you have a expansionary fiscal policy, what happens to aggregate demand? It's up. When you have a restrictive monetary policy, what's the impact? It's down. So what's the combined impact? Ambiguous. Third point, if aggregate demand increases, the downward pressure on currency due to a worsening trade balance may or may not fully offset the upward pressure exerted by capital flows. So anyway, go through this as well as other solutions in the curriculum. Or you could simply memorize this and you'd be covered.